when I was gotten a little older and I was reading more, one of the things that was very fascinating to me was reading and correlating how I had been educated in Florida. And my mother and father sacrificed for me to go, and my sister to attend a Seventh-day Adventist school. I just thought it was due to religious purposes, but there was other reasons. When I read a federally, it was a federal supported pamphlet about education and segregation in this country that was published in 1961, but the data was from the 50s. And there was one set of statistics that really struck me, and that was the ones about states have sent money from the government, from taxpayers' money. And they were talking and referring to how much they spend for each student in each state. For Florida, they spent $150 for white students, and they spent around $14 for a student of color. And then I really started understanding why they wanted to send us to some of these private schools. And when I also looked at this in the same pamphlet, it was about how much they spent on each of the citizens in the state. And let's say, for the sake of argument, in Florida they received $102 or $3. They only spent 5 cents on people of color. And that was for the southern states that were listed in the book. And I found that to be, how could a group of people survive with such little support? So it's obvious for those of us whom were fortunate enough to attend school that we were blessed, because our parents and our loved ones and our grandparents or whatever had gone through great sacrifice to send us to school under such a system. And later, I started comparing it with apartheid in South Africa. And I think that that has really molded me to think the way that I am today and how I look at things today. Because I noticed when I came to New York, the first thing I was doing was getting involved in the apartheid demonstrations. And Leroy Jones, whom is now Amir Baraka, he was involved in all of that. And I remember that was the first time I actually ever saw him. And it was quite interesting that the different people from different movements were involved. And I'm speaking of all different ethnic groups that was involved, but it was a very small group, because you always encountered the same people at every turn, the same group of people. And that some of us got to know each other. And I also remember Ilombe Brathwaite. He was really involved in Africa. And I learned much from him because he knew some of the African leaders. He was very involved and very submerged in the movement. And however it happened to me, everything happened through Mr. Mashore's bookstore. Later, the Frederick Douglass bookstore with Mr. Richard B. Moore. And a little later than that, the one that was the Marxist bookstore down on 13th Street. Between those two bookstores, I think I was educated in many things and what was going on. Now, the fortunate part for me was that I always had a job. For some reason, I was fortunate enough to always be able to work. whatever endeavor. And Mr. Mashaw was very nice to not only me, but other students whom I hung out with. And he would take us to this place called La Famille, the family. And it was an upscale place in Harlem on 125th Street and Fifth Avenue. And it was a very popular hangout for the middle class. And we would have a full dinner that included, for dessert, like peach cobbler pie. And he was doing all of these things for us. He was not complaining. In other words, like if there was 2 of us, he would take us. If there were 5 of us, he would take us. And I think that he was trying to groom us on how to work together and what we should always reach back and help others. I think that was the theory behind it, because it was through Mr. Mashaw that I met many different people. And included in the group that I had met was people like Malcolm X and that of that ilk. And I think that when you're in that kind of environment, well, I must say what prepared me for that kind of environment was my mother's brother, whom we would stay with in New York City. He and his wife, whom had no children at that time, was always taking us places, taking us to the Apollo, to the Strand, to the Paramount, Radio City Music Hall, the Roxy. And that's how I had the opportunity to see these kind of people and meet different musicians. And some of the musicians would come by the house, and I knew people like Ray Nance that played with Duke Ellington, and Babs Gonzalez, and Bobby Tucker, whom was the pianist for Lady Day, Billie Holiday. And after he left her, he went with Billy Eckstine. Very accomplished musicians. And these musicians would get together sometimes and go on, have record dates. And I had the opportunity to go on record dates. So I think it prepared me for being around people whom were known. So I was not really impressed with Malcolm as a celebrity. I was impressed with Malcolm because of his ability to learn. And he was always moving forward. And he would pick up his books from Mr. Mashaw every month. And his conversations were always different. And I noticed that they had a certain progression to them. And I have a scrapbook of some of the incidents that happened after he was suspended. And I would visualize how in one of the cartoons they had Malcolm's head bouncing down the street. And I said, how could they do this to a person whom actually built that organization? Because if history is correct, when Malcolm first joined that organization after he was released from prison, they had strongholds in only 2 places, Detroit and Chicago. And when Malcolm was suspended from that organization, they had 24 or more mosques around the country. And Malcolm actually was the one that organized all of that. He was always traveling. And I had never really heard Malcolm speak until much later. And when I heard him speak one day, it was in front of Mr. Mashaw's bookstore. And the strangest thing about that, I was walking from the subway, and here he was speaking. Now, I wondered first, why was all these people and the traffic was blocked on the 7th Avenue? And when I say blocked, I mean blocked. You had to go find another way to go around. And everything else, it was just so interesting. And my first I was standing across the street. I didn't try to make it over to in front of the bookstore. I was across the street standing in front of Al's pants store. He made pants with the peg legs and all of that kind of thing. And I was standing there. And I remember him saying, see that? And he was pointing at a policeman. And the policeman was standing near where I was standing. And he says, see him? Look at him. He's nothing but a blue-eyed, blonde-headed devil. That's what you're up against. And I thought for a moment, I says, I've never heard anyone just say all of these things so plain. And I was really afraid for him. And at that time, I says, you know something? I don't think they're going to let him live very long because he's too straightforward. He's not camouflaging what he's feeling or what he's saying. And now this is years before this incident of him being assassinated happened. But it was just, that was the kind of impression he made on me. And when I had the opportunity to talk to him in the bookstore again, I told him about my feelings and everything, and he invited me down to the mosque. He never asked me to join or anything, but I went by the mosque a couple of times and by the restaurant. And I had the opportunity to observe him up close. And by observing him up close, I mean the way he would treat the sisters and the brothers that belonged to the nation, how much respect he had for them. The sisters would sometimes come to them and complain about their husbands not doing right at home. And he would make a note of it in his book, and he said, don't worry, sister, I'll take care of it. And the reason that he could take care of it, because he had an army to do all of those things. And they would send people out, like say if I was not bringing my money home for a couple of weeks, and my wife went to him and complained about it. 2 brothers would come and visit me on my job, and they would say that brother minister had sent them down to talk to me because my wife had complained. And if I acted up in any way, I would be on the ground, and they would be picking me up, brushing me off, asking, what happened to you, brother? Did you fall down? Did you stumble or something? And all of these things, I became more and more interested in respecting him as a person whom loved his people. And we became friendly enough for me to talk to him at home, and we discussed different things. But the idea for me was that he was always learning, and he was different from any of the other leaders, because the other leaders were very self-contained. They didn't reach out to other leaders. It's that everyone wanted to do their own thing. And that kind of deterred me from joining anything at all, or any of these organizations, because they all seemed to be only for self. And one of the things I knew as a youngster, you do not really accomplish anything if you want to be an individual. That is the hype of the system as far as I'm concerned. You have things and create things by working together.